The economy of Ireland is a modern knowledge economy, focusing on services and high-tech industries and dependent on trade, industry and investment. In terms of GNP per capita, a better measure of national income, Ireland ranks below the OECD average, despite significant growth in recent years. At 10th in the OECD 28 rankings. GDP is significantly greater than GNP due to the repatriation of profits and royalty payments by multinational firms based in Ireland. A 2005 study by The Economist found Ireland to have the best quality of life in the world. The 1995 to 2007 period of very high economic growth, with a record of posting the highest growth rates in Europe, led many to call the country the Celtic Tiger. One of the keys to this economic growth was a low corporation tax, currently at 12.5% standard rate. The Irish financial crisis severely affected the economy, compounding domestic economic problems related to the collapse of the Irish property bubble. After 24 years of continuous growth at an annual level during 1984 to 2007, Ireland first experienced a short technical recession from Q2-Q3 2007. Followed by a long two-year recession from Q1 2008-Q4 2009. In March 2008, Ireland had the highest level of household debt relative to disposable income in the developed world at 190%, causing a further slowdown in private consumption, and thus also being one of the reasons for the long-lasting recession. The hard economic climate was reported in April 2010, even to have led to a resumed emigration. After a year with stagnant economic activity in 2010, Irish real GDP rose by 2.2% in 2011 and 0.2% in 2012, which was mainly driven by strong improvements in the export sector, while private consumption remained subdued. The economic challenges continued, however, as the prolonged European sovereign debt crisis caused a new Irish recession starting in Q3 2012, which was still ongoing as of Q2 2013. In May 2013, the European Commission's economic forecast for Ireland predicted its growth rates would return to a positive 1.1% in 2013 and 2.2% in 2014. The Irish economy grew by 4.8% in 2014, with predictions of growth of 6% in 2015. As of 2015, Ireland was ranked as the world's 9th most economically free economy in an index created by free market economists from the Wall Street Journal and Heritage Foundation. The Index of Economic Freedom. History. Since the Irish Free State from the 1920s, Ireland had high trade barriers such as high tariffs, particularly during the economic war with Britain in the 1930s, and a policy of import substitution. During the 1950s, 400,000 people emigrated from Ireland. It became increasingly clear that economic nationalism was unsustainable. While other European countries enjoyed fast growth, Ireland suffered economic stagnation. The policy changes were drawn together in Economic Development, an official paper published in 1958 that advocated free trade, foreign investment, and growth rather than fiscal restraint as the prime objective of economic management. In the 1970s, the population increased by 15% and national income increased at an annual rate of about 4%. Employment increased by around 1% per year, but the state sector amounted to a large part of that. Public sector employment was a third of the total workforce by 1980. Budget deficits and public debt increased, leading to the crisis in the 1980s. During the 1980s, underlying economic problems became pronounced. Middle-income workers were taxed 60% of their marginal income, unemployment had risen to 20%, Annual overseas emigration reached over 1% of population, and public deficits reached 15% of GDP. In 1987, Fianna Fáil reduced public spending, cut taxes, and promoted competition. Ryanair used Ireland's deregulated aviation market and helped European regulators to see benefits of competition in transport markets. Intel invested in 1989 and was followed by a number of technology companies such as Microsoft and Google. A consensus exists among all government parties about the sustained economic growth. The GDP per capita in the OECD Prosperity Ranking rose from 21st in 1993 to 4th in 2002. Between 1985 and 2002, private sector jobs increased 59%. The economy shifted from an agriculture to a knowledge economy, focusing on services and high-tech industries. Economic growth averaged 10% from 1995 to 2000, and 7% from 2001 to 2004. Industry, which accounts for 46% of GDP and about 80% of exports, has replaced agriculture as the country's leading sector. Celtic Tiger. The economy benefited from a rise in consumer spending, construction, and business investment. Since 1987, a key part of economic policy has been social partnership, which is a neo-corporatist set of voluntary, paid pacts between the government, employers and trade unions. The 1995 to 2000 period of high economic growth was called the Celtic Tiger, a reference to the tiger economies of East Asia. GDP growth continued to be relatively robust, with a rate of about 6% in 2001, over 4% in 2004, and 4.7% in 2005. With high growth came high inflation. Prices in Dublin were considerably higher than elsewhere in the country, especially in the property market. However, property prices are falling following the recent economic recession. At the end of July 2008, the annual rate of inflation was at 4.4% or 3.6%, and inflation actually dropped slightly from the previous month. In terms of GDP per capita, Ireland is ranked as one of the wealthiest countries in the OECD and the EU 27, at 4th in the OECD 28 rankings. In terms of GNP per capita, a better measure of national income, Ireland ranks below the OECD average, despite significant growth in recent years, at 10th in the OECD 28 rankings. GDP is significantly greater than GNP due to the large number of multinational firms based in Ireland. A 2005 study by The Economist found Ireland to have the best quality of life in the world. The positive reports and economic statistics masked several underlying imbalances. The construction sector, which was inherently cyclical in nature, accounted for a significant component of Ireland's GDP. A recent downturn in residential property market sentiment has highlighted the overexposure of the Irish economy to construction, which now presents a threat to economic growth. Despite several successive years of economic growth and significant improvements since 2000, Ireland's population is marginally more at risk of poverty than the EU 15 average, and 6.8% of the population suffer consistent poverty. Economic downturn. It was the first country in the EU to officially enter a recession related to the financial crisis 2008, as declared by the Central Statistics Office. Ireland now has the second highest level of household debt in the world. The country's credit rating was downgraded to AA by Standard & Poor's ratings agency in August 2010 due to the cost of supporting the banks, which would weaken the government's financial flexibility over the medium term. It transpired that the cost of recapitalizing the banks was greater than expected at that time, and, in response to the mounting costs, the country's credit rating was again downgraded by Standard & Poor's to A. The global recession has significantly impacted the Irish economy. Economic growth was 4.7% in 2007, but -1.7% in 2008 and -7.1% in 2009. In mid-2010, Ireland looked like it was about to exit recession in 2010 following growth of 0.3% in Q4 of 2009 and 2.7% in Q1 of 2010. The government forecast a 0.3% expansion. However, the economy experienced Q2 negative growth of -1.2%, and in the fourth quarter, the GDP shrunk by 1.6%. Overall, the GDP was reduced by 1% in 2010, making it the third consecutive year of negative growth. On the other hand, Ireland recorded the biggest month-on-month rise for industrial production across the Eurozone in 2010, with 7.9% growth in September compared to August, followed by Estonia and Denmark. The second problem, unacknowledged by management of Irish banks, the financial regulator and the Irish government, is solvency. The question concerning solvency has arisen due to domestic problems in the crashing Irish property market. Irish financial institutions have substantial exposure to property developers in their loan portfolio. In 2008, property developers had an oversupply of property, with much unsold as demand significantly diminished. The employment growth of the past that attracted many immigrants from Eastern Europe and propped up demand for property was replaced by rising unemployment. Irish property developers speculated billions of euros in overvalued land parcels such as urban brownfield and greenfield sites. They also speculated in agricultural land which, in 2007, had an average value of €23,600 per acre, which is several multiples above the value of equivalent land in other European countries. Lending to builders and developers has grown to such an extent that it equals 28% of all bank lending, or the approximate value of all public deposits with retail banks. Effectively, the Irish banking system has taken all its shareholders' equity, with a substantial chunk of its depositors' cash on top, and handed it over to builders and property speculators. By comparison, just before the Japanese bubble burst in late 1989, construction and property development had grown to a little over 25% of bank lending. Irish banks correctly identify a systematic risk of triggering an even more severe financial crisis in Ireland if they were to call in the loans as they fall due. The loans are subject to terms and conditions, referred to as covenants. These covenants are being waived in fear of provoking the bankruptcy of many. Property developers and banks are thought to be lending some developers further cash to pay their interest bills, which means that they are not classified as bad debts by the banks. Furthermore, the banks' impairment provisions are still at very low levels. This does not appear to be consistent with the real negative changes taking place in property market fundamentals. On the 30th of September 2008, the Irish government declared a guarantee that intends to safeguard the Irish banking system. The Irish National Guarantee, backed by taxpayer funds, covers all deposits, covered bonds, senior debt and dated subordinated debt. In exchange for the bailout, the government did not take preferred equity stakes in the banks, nor did they demand that top banking executives' salaries and bonuses be capped, or that board members be replaced. Despite the government guarantees to the banks, their shareholder value continued to decline, and on the 15th of January 2009, the government nationalized Anglo-Irish Bank, which had a market capitalization of less than 2% of its peak in 2007. Subsequent to this, further pressure came on the other two large Irish banks, who on the 19th of January 2009, had share values fall by between 47 and 50% in one day. As of the 11th of October 2008, leaked reports of possible actions by the government to artificially prop up the property developers have been revealed. In contrast, on the 7th of October 2008, Danske Bank wrote off a substantial sum largely due to property-related losses incurred by its Irish subsidiary, National Irish Bank. The 3.18% charge against the loan book of its Irish operations is the first significant write-off to take place and is a modest indication of the extent of the more substantial future charges to be incurred by the overexposed domestic banks. Asset write-downs by the domestically owned Irish banks are only now slowly beginning to take place. In November 2010, the Irish government published a National Recovery Plan, which aimed to restore order to the public finances and to bring its deficit in line with the EU target of 3% of economic output by 2015. The plan envisaged a budget adjustment of €15 billion over a 4-year period. This was front-loaded in 2011, when measures totaling €6 billion took place. Subsequent budgetary adjustments of €3 billion per year were put in place up to 2015, to reduce the government deficit to less than 3% of GDP. That would increase to 23% by 2014. A property tax was reintroduced in 2012. This was initially charged in 2012 as a flat rate on all properties and subsequently charged at a level of 0.18% of the estimated market value of a property from 2013. Domestic water charges are to be introduced in 2015. Expenditure cuts included reductions in public sector pay levels, reductions in the number of public sector employees through early retirement schemes, reduced social welfare payments and reduced health spending. As a result of increased taxation and decreased government spending, the Central Statistics Office reported that the Irish government deficit had decreased from 32.5% of GDP in 2010 to 5.7% of GDP in 2013. In addition, Ireland's unemployment rate fell from a peak of 15.1% in February 2012 to 10.6% in December 2014. The number of people in employment increased by 58,000 in the year to September 2013. On the 27th of February 2014, the government launched its Action Plan for Jobs 2014, which followed similar plans initiated in 2013 and 2012. Beginning of recovery. Celtic Phoenix is a term coined by journalist and satirist Paul Howard for his fictional Ross O'Carroll Kelly character, since occasionally used by some economic commentators and media outlets to describe the economic growth in some sectors in Ireland since 2014. In late 2013, Ireland exited an EU, ECB, IMF bailout. The Irish economy began to recover in 2014, growing by 4.8%, making Ireland the fastest-growing economy in the European Union. Contributing factors to growth included a recovering construction sector, quantitative easing, a weak euro, and low oil prices. This growth helped to reduce national debt to 109% of GDP, and the budget deficit fell to 3.1% in the fourth quarter. The headline unemployment rate remained steady at 10%, though the youth unemployment rate remained higher than the EU average, at over 20%. Emigration had continued to play a significant factor in unemployment statistics, though the emigration rate also began to fall in 2014. Property prices also increased in 2014, growing fastest in Dublin. This was due to a housing shortage, especially in the Dublin area. The demand for housing caused some recovery in the Irish construction and property sectors. By early 2015, house price increases nationally began to outpace those in Dublin. Cork saw house prices rise by 7.2%, while Galway prices rose by 6.8%. Prices in Limerick were 6.7% higher, while in Waterford there was a 4.9% increase. The housing crisis resulted in over 20,000 applicants being on the social housing list in the Dublin City Council area for the first time. In May 2015, the Insolvency Service of Ireland reported to the OE Reactors Justice Committee that 110,000 mortgages were in arrears. and 37,000 of those are in arrears of over 720 days. On 14 October 2014, Minister for Finance Michael Noonan and Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform Brendan Howlin introduced the budget for 2015, the first in 7 years to include tax cuts and spending increases. It reversed some of the austerity measures that had been introduced over the previous 6 years, with increased spending and tax cuts worth just over €1 billion. In April 2015, during a spring economic statement, Noonan and Howlin outlined the government's plans and projections up to the year 2020. This included policy statements on expansionary budgets, deficit management plans and proposed cuts to the universal social charge and other taxes. He also said that Ireland had made a significant contribution to the stabilisation of the euro, while Taoiseach Enda Kenny praised the economic growth, and said that Ireland would seek to avoid returning to a boom-and-bust cycle. He noted that other areas of the economy remained fragile. Some other commentators have suggested that, depending on the Eurozone, world economic outlook as well as other internal and external factors, the growth seen in Ireland in 2014 and early 2015 may not indicate a longer-term pattern for sustainable economic improvement. The European Commission also acknowledged the recovery and growth, but warned that any extra government revenue should be used to further reduce the national debt.